Hey everyone! Today, we're looking at a truly fascinating intersection, literally the exact point where architectural design meets high-end baking. We're going to dive straight into 2026 cake design trends to really unpack the plaster aesthetic. What is the plaster aesthetic in cake design exactly? Well, we're going to figure that out and see why it's completely revolutionizing the industry right now. If you love seeing how structure, science, and art come together to create something totally unforgettable, you are in the exact right place.
Okay, so let's kick things off with a question that might sound a little out there at first. What does a 2026 wedding cake have in common with Venetian plaster? I mean, for decades, a cake was really just a dessert, right? It was this predictable, three-tiered stack of white sugar sitting quietly in the corner of a reception hall. But not anymore. Today, the modern cake has completely evolved into a primary visual anchor. It's a structural centerpiece. It is literally fine art that just happens to be edible. And the most cutting-edge designers out there, they're pulling their inspiration directly from industrial design and interior architecture.
To really get where we are in 2026, we kind of have to look in the rearview mirror at what we're leaving behind. For years, the ultimate goal was the clinical perfection of traditional fondant. You know the look? A flawless, flat, almost plastic-looking finish that was super rigid and honestly often tipped into that cheesy, overly themed territory. But today, we are seeing a massive shift toward joyfully imperfect, highly textured buttercream. We're basically ditching smooth, manufactured perfection and fully embracing intentional marks, rough ridges, and a really tactile finish that practically invites you to touch it. It just feels wonderfully handmade.
What's absolutely wild is how this texture is being showcased. Modern clients are demanding cakes that act as monochromatic sculptures. So instead of relying on this chaotic explosion of different colors or, a million wired sugar flowers, designers are committing to a single, bold color. Think deep charcoal, a vibrant sunset orange, or just pure architectural white. By keeping the whole palette monochromatic, the architectural shape and the physical texture of the cake are forced to take center stage. It creates this incredibly sleek, high-end look without any of the visual clutter.
And that brings us to the absolute hottest trend in minimalist cake design right now. The plaster aesthetic. So what is it? Basically, this technique uses specific mediums, stuff like stiffened ganache or a high-ratio buttercream, but it's applied not with traditional cake smoothing tools. Instead, it's heavily worked with a palette knife. The whole goal is to make the surface of the cake actually resemble raw organic stone or genuine Venetian plaster. It's this incredible illusion that completely blurs the line between a culinary dessert and a structural piece of room decor.
When you actually break down this plaster look, a few distinct characteristics really stand out. First off, it mimics raw, earthy textures with a highly tactile, handcrafted feel. It also prioritizes organic movement over rigid, straight lines. But perhaps most importantly, and this is key, it interacts dynamically with light and shadow. Because the surface is rough-hewn and packed with these intentional ridges, it catches the ambient lighting of a gallery or a historic venue in a deeply dramatic way. A perfectly smooth fondant cake, it simply cannot catch the light the way a textured plaster finish cake does.
But here is where we have to transition from visual artistry into hardcore culinary mechanics. Because let me tell you, you cannot achieve this heavy, sweeping architectural look with just any frosting from a grocery store box. It just won't work. If you try to build thick, stone-like ridges with a weak icing, it's going to slide right off the cake, or worse, just melt into a puddle under warm event lighting. To actually nail the plaster aesthetic, you have to master the culinary science of stable frosting.
And the science behind our available mediums is just fascinating. For instance, American buttercream is definitely the easiest to make, but it forms a thin crust and can be incredibly sweet. Then you have Swiss meringue, which is silky smooth, sure, but only moderately stable. For heavy architectural textures, you really need the heavy hitters. We're talking Italian meringue, which can actually stand up to high room temperatures without melting, making it absolutely brilliant for holding thick ridges. And then we have Korean glossy buttercream, which is this brilliant innovation that holds its shape exceptionally well and looks almost transparent.
Now, when it comes to the plaster aesthetic specifically, high-ratio buttercream and stiffened ganache are the undisputed champions. Honestly, it's almost like edible engineering. High-ratio buttercream uses shortening alongside butter to provide just incredible structural strength, all while lightening the overall color. Stiffened ganache, on the other hand, gives you this dense, workable medium that behaves almost exactly like a real plaster compound. These highly stable formulas are the true foundation that makes all this art possible.
So how is this actually applied in the real world? Well, the tools of the trade for 2026 cake artists look a lot more like the tools of a fine art oil painter. We're talking palette knives, offset spatulas, cake combs, and yeah, even skewers and toothpicks. Decorators are totally ditching those massive bench scrapers they used to use for perfectly flat edges. Instead, they're grabbing palette knives to build movement, using sweeping strokes directly onto the canvas of the cake.
If you were going to try and execute this finish yourself, here's how it would go. First, you'd apply a really thick layer of that highly stable icing we just talked about. Next, you'd use sweeping palette knife strokes to build horizontal or diagonal movement across the tier. Then, you intentionally cultivate ridges. You actively want peaks and valleys to catch the light. And step 4, while step 4 is usually the hardest for any perfectionist out there, stop before it looks overworked. The entire charm of this aesthetic relies on it looking completely natural. If you fuss with it too much, the magic just totally vanishes. And actually, that rule brilliantly illustrates the driving philosophy behind this entire movement. The plaster aesthetic is deeply rooted in wabi-sabi. This is a traditional Japanese philosophy focused on finding immense beauty in things that are natural, organic, and slightly imperfect. It's a profound rejection of that clinical, machine-made perfection that dominated the wedding industry for so long. It basically tells us that a cake absolutely doesn't need to look like it was stamped out in a factory to be breathtakingly beautiful. This is exactly why clients in 2026 are so obsessed with this specific aesthetic. It champions handcrafted authenticity over mass-produced uniformity. When guests look at a plaster finished cake, they instantly recognize the human touch of the artist. They see the sweeping strokes of the palette knife, those intentional ridges, the bespoke nature of the whole design. It just makes the cake feel genuinely alive, deeply personal, and highly exclusive.
I absolutely love this quote from our source material because it perfectly summarizes the core thesis of this whole 2026 trend. A cake doesn't need a million sugar flowers or a dramatic topper to feel special. Sometimes it's the simplest cake in the room that looks the most expensive. That right there is the quiet, restrained confidence of the textured, monochromatic cake. It doesn't need to shout to be the most stunning piece of art in the room. The texture does all the heavy lifting.
So, we've seen how Venetian plaster and raw stone have been beautifully translated into buttercream and ganache, but it leaves us with a truly fascinating question to end on. As culinary engineering and sculptural design continue to blur their boundaries, what other architectural textures are we going to see translated into edible art next? I mean, could we see the intricate grain of reclaimed wood, or maybe the sleek, matte finish of poured concrete? The possibilities for structured, visual design and baking are just endless.